Hi, and welcome to part one of our three-part series on teaching and learning and understanding by design. I'm Sonia Tellier, Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Secondary Education.
And I'm Zachary Wadekar, Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Elementary Education.
And together we're going to walk you through the three stages of understanding by design, beginning here in this first part with stage one, desired results.
Falmouth Public Schools has been working with the Understanding by Design framework for many years, so it's not anything new to many of our veteran staff. But as we know, we have new staff coming in all the time, and it's a really good way to hopefully refresh our audience as to the three different stages. And as Sonia said, today we'll be focusing on the first stage, desired results. So hopefully you have some awareness of understanding by design, and this will help to reinforce what you already know. If you're a newcomer, this would be a great introduction before you did some further study.
The understanding by design framework is very important to our priority around vertical and horizontal alignment of our curriculum, ensuring that our students have consistent but scaffolded experiences building upon their current knowledge to really extend themselves and take on the most appropriate level of challenges they develop.
Today, in front of you right now, you have the agenda for our presentation today. So first we're going to talk a little bit about Falmouth Public Schools strategic plan. A lot of the work that we do is built around that strategic plan, and we'll talk a little bit about the teaching and learning aspects of that. And then we'll be talking more about the actual Understanding by Design framework, what it means and why we use it. And as we mentioned, today we'll be talking about stage one, desired results.
Throughout this series, you're going to see three parts as we break down the segments of stage one. Within each of those four segments, you're going to see where we call it out in the design template. We're going to give you some guidance, which comes in two forms. In some cases, it comes in the form of questions that if you're answering those questions will help you fill out those different areas. And in some cases, it comes with some highlighted information, some pointers that get you going in the right direction. And then we're going to talk about common pitfalls, and we're going to connect you to the variety of resources produced by Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, really the two principal authors on much of the research and the guidance documents around understanding by design.
As Sonia mentioned, they are the founding principles of understanding by design, but Falmouth Public Schools has kind of taken its own spin on the UbD template, and we'll be showing you later on in our series some of the parts of the template that are exclusive to Falmouth Public Schools. First, we'll talk a little bit again about our strategic plan, which anchors a lot of the work that we do in the district. Our strategic plan is broken into three primary areas. First being teaching and learning, second is access and equity, and third is community engagement.
And while we talk about this as being part of the series on teaching and learning, because this particular initiative statement comes from that objective of teaching and learning, we would be remiss if we didn't stop and talk about the connections between access and equity and community engagement, because all those, the dynamics of those three areas of our strategic plan are what make the formula for success for our students. So each one is intertwined in the other, but we're really going to call out in particular this initiative statement from the teaching and learning objective.
So as part of our teaching and learning plan, our initiative statement 1 is to build internal capacity to fully implement understanding by design as a system for developing curricular activities for students ages 3 through 22. So UbD is not a curriculum program, but it's more of a format that can be used by those who are designing curriculum in the backwards by design approach. So that way we're sure of what our intended outcomes are for students before we even start the planning process.
So as we go through, here's an overview. As we mentioned, there are three stages, and so this series will be delivered in three parts, this being the first. It's important for us to talk about the fact that within stage one, there are the four different components we're going to talk about here, which are established goals, transfer, meaning, and acquisition. And within a couple of those, it's going to break down into some further subparts. But it's really also important for us to call out that this is about reflection, and it's about forging meaning. And in forging meaning, we're going to talk a lot about skills and knowledge that students are going to acquire to develop patterns, develop their own schema, and really make a new understanding of additional information as it presents itself in their learning.
As part of this three-part series, our next webcast or screencast will be the Stage 2 evidence piece, which is the assessment part of unit development. And then Stage 3 will be the learning plan, which is more of the day-to-day learning activities that students engage in. But today we'll be talking again about Stage 1, desired results. And when we talk about desired results, we're talking about having that end in mind. What's the goal for the lessons that you're teaching?
So as we talk about that, we've called out here from the unit planning template the specific matters around Stage 1. So you can see where within the template each of our 4 key parts are. So here we have the heading Stage 1, and we're going to begin by going in and talking about established goals. So within the established goals, we have 2 key questions that we would like to have answered as this part of the template is filled out. First, what relevant goals, for example, content standards, which can come from national standards, state standards, which are being revised. The most current one to be released is science, hopefully in the fall, but looking more towards the winter, early 2016. Or local initiatives, again, stemming from the strategic plan, course objectives and learning outcomes. But what relevant goals will be addressed through the design or unit development? And then what habits of mind and cross-disciplinary goals, for example, 21st century skills or core competencies, will this unit address?
So while we do often talk about the Massachusetts learning standards, when we're looking back at this portion of the template, it's important to note that besides regular learning standards, your department or your school may certainly have its own other goals that they hope students acquire through various lessons, and that would be more than appropriate to include in your template as well. You will also notice, for those who have been engaged in UBD work in the past, that the template does look a little different than it had in the past. This is what they call their version 2.0. The established goals area used to be at the top running horizontally, but now, as you can see, it runs vertically on the left-hand side of that column. So any goal that you're establishing for students would be put in that box on the left.
Also, as we're talking about the goals, we're also going to talk about performance. What is the performance in which you expect students to engage that would demonstrate their learning and demonstrate that they're able to achieve the goals? So in further talking about the goals, we want to come back and talk about some possible pitfalls, problems in the unit design. So we are building our knowledge by working with Solving 25 Problems in Unit Design, a book or guide or a companion book released by Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins. And we've got that specific resource information in our works cited at the conclusion. But as they walk their way through some of these different pitfalls, there's 2 that we'd like to call out regarding Stage 1 in talking about goals. The first, as you can see here, are unit goals fail to distinguish the means versus the end. A common mistake, as you can see as you read through here, is that within the goals, we call out sometimes just particular facts that we want students to memorize, or maybe there's 1 or 2 key skills, but they're low level. They're just small chunks in the greater realm of understanding. And so we don't get towards those larger or more complex learning goals. And that's where we really start to develop those understandings, and we look towards performance. What's the performance in which the student's going to engage to show that they're successful? Because mastery, as you can see, is more than just the learning of isolated bits of information. It's more than that ability to recall a series of facts or key dates. Mastery refers to the effective use of knowledge and skills in complex situations, and a key part of this is going to come up in the next section here on Stage 1 when we talk about transfer, because that's going to be not only complex situations but novel situations where the students are going to have to build upon their understandings to navigate what's new to them.
So when you're using this template to craft your own units of study, it's important to remember that in the established goals section, there are a couple things to keep in mind. First off, this goes back to the learning in isolated bits, that these aren't your day-to-day learning goals. Obviously, when you're engaged in a long unit of study, maybe 3 or 6 weeks, there are tons of things that students will be learning along the way. But when you're establishing this section of the template, this is really what is the overall outcome that you're looking for. Furthermore, it's important to remember when you're crafting your unit plan that the only goals that you're going to list in this box are goals in which you're going to measure proficiency at the end of the unit or at least along the course of the unit. Many times we talk about during units of study, many concepts and skills are touched upon the way, but for the sake of using this UBD template, it's only the standards or goals that will be measured and assessed that you want to include in this section of the template.
And so, as Zach pointed out earlier, it's possible that within a department or within a grade level or within a school, we might have particular objectives or initiatives that we want to embed here as part of our established goals. However, it is possible that you're just calling out a handful of standards that are related to the unit that are important to working your way both through the unit but also towards student success, scaffolding them up towards another upcoming unit or something in another discipline. So there are a couple ways to approach this, but you just want to be careful that you don't put so much information there that you get lost moving through the next steps. You really want to be choosy about what goes here, recognizing that this is just one of many units in which you'll engage the students over the course of the academic year.
As we progress through the end of this presentation, Sonia and I will actually be showing you a presentation or a sample of a stage 1 that is completely composed. And when we go through that part, I think if you're having any questions as we go along, some of those questions may be answered when we show you our sample, and that's coming up shortly.
Oh, and then just before we leave the slide, we want to point out a second possible problem in unit design related to goals, and that's that the unit goals are not clearly related. So we're always talking about coherence of learning, unity, and we want that coherence visible to students. Sometimes we get caught up in our own train of thought as educators, and we understand, the connection between leaving point A and arriving at point B, even if it's a zigzagged path, but the students don't always see that. And so we want them to understand and have as much of a sense of connection to the topic and understanding as we may have. Maybe not to the same depth that we have as educators, but certainly we want them to see the way. And so that's what we're getting at here in this second pitfall.
Continuing on with stage 1 of understanding by design, we're going to look at that second box on the template, and that second box is titled transfer. When we look at transfer, we're talking about what will students independently be able to do based on the learning that they're doing within this unit.
And I think another key part here is this is another one of those expansions as part of the 2.0 UBD design template. So this is a new feature for some of you who may have been using the older model. So we're going to talk a little bit about this here moving forward with transfer. And as you can see, there's a guide or lead-in. Students will be able to independently use their learning too. So here are some helpful questions to guide you into filling out this section of the unit design. So you can ask yourself, what will the students be able to do as a result of this design to aid vertical and horizontal alignment of learning? So not just what they're doing within the unit, how does it help them connect the information or understandings that they developed in a previous unit? How is it going to set the stage for their learning moving forward? But beyond that, beyond the sort of horizontal scope of the grade in which they're now in, what's the vertical connection? How is this connected to their readiness for the next grade level, or if they're moving from middle school towards junior high towards high school? How does this in the grander scheme connect so that students aren't necessarily relearning old material as they mature, but getting a more sophisticated sense of understanding as they move through and getting more complex information?
And sometimes we need to do a better job in working with our teachers to help them understand what the transfer is. And sometimes when we're so tied into our own content level and our own curriculum, we don't really know what the transfer is going to be as well. And that's why it's important as classroom teachers to really understand how the skills and content that you're exposing students to each year builds year after year, and also knowing where the students came to you from and the transfer from previous years and how that's aiding in your classroom.
And then finally, the third guiding question here gets at students' awareness of who they are, and then also the perspectives that they develop in being able to understand the others around them. And I think that Zach and I have already mentioned a couple of key words. One is schema, and the other being patterns. What we take in the world and the patterns that we make help us to interpret the new information that comes at us. And so that's something that we actually consider in transfer is the influence of our personal perspectives on how we can interpret information and forge those understandings. So you hear us repeating some key words, understanding being one that's being repeated quite a bit here, but I think it's really helping to forge, well, I'm going to use it again, a better understanding of why the backwards design approach works. When you start with the end in mind and you're really clear about where you want students to end their learning in a particular unit or maybe the greater scope of a course, you're also equally deliberate and meaningful in the map that you create to guide them towards that end point. So we can't repeat that enough. So please bear with us if you're hearing that one word stand out. That's a good thing.
And as a classroom teacher, if you are using this template to develop units of study, really this transfer section is helping you to identify kind of that so what mentality of why am I teaching this lesson? What's the goal? Or how are these skills and the concepts that you're addressing with students going to help students later on? And that's something that all teachers should be thinking. It shouldn't necessarily be tied into that one day's lesson, but thinking about how that lesson is then going to carry over or transfer into the upcoming lessons and then certainly the upcoming content that students will be exposed to in future school years.
So with that, let's look at a couple of the common pitfalls. And again, we're drawing from that same McTighe and Wiggins source book, Solving 25 Problems in Unit Design, and we call out two of their problems within stage one. The first being that the unit is overly activity oriented. Sometimes we can get so caught up in designing a unit and having a couple of really great activities that we think will really excite the students that we start to chain activities and we don't necessarily get at the depth. So as you can see here, it's typically not the activity that causes the deep learning of the transfer, it's processing the activity. So after you've engaged in that activity, how do you reflect upon it? How do you debrief it? And giving students the time to do that allows them to determine their understanding or what meaning they're taking away from it, which allows them then to create the generalizations that aid transfer and link them up to the next bit of information or the next skill that's presented.
And the other end of that spectrum is that the unit is coverage oriented and it doesn't bring in enough of the activities. So we're really talking about having that balance of having strategically designed activities that are going to support the content coverage that's happening in the classroom. So specifically when units have too much coverage going into it is that there's no real plan for causing learning, as it says here. It's merely a plan for what the teacher will talk about. And the real need in planning and teaching for understanding is to discover the material.
Right. We move beyond cover to discover. We're going to move forward from transfer to talk about the next of our facets within stage one, and that's of meaning. And meaning breaks down into two parts. One is understandings, and the other is essential questions.
So for those of you who do have previous knowledge of understanding by design, this should look very familiar. The understandings and essential questions help the teacher in creating that learning plan and determining really what are the areas of those established goals or what parts of the established goals really are going to help carry over into the learning plan and the assessment that would come after that.
So here we've swapped a little bit in our protocol for providing guidance. We've transitioned away from questions and we've provided you some bulleted points to help you gauge whether or not you're on the right path at both identifying the understandings for the unit and identifying the essential questions.
So when we look at the understandings, these will give you a list of things to consider again when you're starting to determine what the results are that you want for your students at the end of the unit. So just a couple of these are the ideas that result from analyzing and reflecting on one's learning. The understandings provide context and clarity to content that you may not have previously been understood.
Also, just to draw off that point, to go back to the piece that we just talked about with transfer, having the end in mind, this is that roadmap that you're creating. So no matter how windy the path may be, getting to the destination, If you have a clear context and you're providing clarity to the learning and you've got that clear frame, your student should be able to follow along and be successful in navigating that path.
Something to consider too when you're crafting out these understandings is that you want to make sure that there's room for your students to personalize these understandings and for it to be open to interpretation. As the teacher, a lot of times you're facilitating a lot of these discussions and exposing the students to new content. However, one of the ultimate goals is that students will then take these and form their own understandings. So that's something to consider when you're crafting your unit plan as well, that you don't want to have students necessarily take away your understandings, but you want to facilitate the process of them creating their own understandings along the way.
And with Zach talking about the fact that understandings are open to interpretation, that's the perfect segue to talk about essential questions, which are open-ended. They're inquiry-based. They're questions that are really deviating from the sense of right and wrong with one clear answer and really forcing students to use those understandings to arrive at a number of different answers to the essential questions. There are overarching questions that are going to guide learning and foster inquiry throughout the entire unit. It's not, you focus on this question today and this other question next week, and then they both appear on the test. It's a very different process for asking questions and getting students engaged. They're ongoing and guiding. As I mentioned, they cover the process of learning throughout the unit. They might shift a little bit. Students' answers might shift depending on where they are in developing their understandings. And they might also influence the teacher to shift a little bit based on the conversation and the inquiry that happens and the research that's uncovered along the way. But they're essential to the educational process. They help learners achieve that greater focus and understanding, especially if the students as learners have the opportunity to influence the revision of those questions.
So these essential questions are meant to guide thinking and to guide synthesizing material. And they're not necessarily questions that would be on an end of unit test or a prompt that students would respond to. However, students can certainly be made aware of these essential questions prior to starting a unit. It's a great way to build background knowledge and formative assessment for teachers to see where students are as far as their previous understanding of some of these concepts and skills. And it's great for teachers to check in with students throughout the unit of study and re-engage in these essential questions just to keep that focus in mind.
So with that said, let's talk about that pitfall. What happens when essential questions aren't essential? Again, building from our guidebook with McTighe and Wiggins, we want to again reinforce, and we can't say it enough, that essential questions are inherently open-ended. There's no clear right and wrong. There's no sense of black and white here. There's a lot that's left to interpretation as students filter through their personal experiences, take in the information, and really forge their own understandings. The essential questions are there to get interest going, to get that higher order thinking really accelerated. They support discussion, and sometimes they spark debate. They recur productively over time, and they should be revisited as they point towards the important transferable, going back to that last facet, ideas and processes within and across disciplines.
As we mentioned earlier, we'll be looking at an example of Stage 1 very shortly, and we'll be seeing how some of these essential questions can be written and how they can help to drive instruction forward. The last part of Stage 1 that we're going to talk about today is acquisition. This is really what you want students to know and what they will be skilled at, or what we used to call what students will be able to do. So when we talk about content knowledge, we're talking about what the students will know, and when we're talking about skill acquisition, we're talking about what students will be able to do as a result of the work.
So as we talked about at the start of this process here today and talking about Stage 1, let's talk over here on the students will know. Sometimes factual information is important. It's not about how many facts a student can remember, but it's about the key factual information that you need to forge that understanding. And that's not to say that that information can't be accessed again over time if a student forgets it, but that they can recall or make some connection back to it because they've been exposed to it. There's always key vocabulary, key words that are new to a field, to a discipline, um, or maybe just new in a more advanced work of literature. So there's always vocabulary work to be done, and certainly content knowledge and concepts. Sometimes discipline specific, and sometimes they're just key pieces that really aid that transfer.
So when we talk about what students will know, whether it be factual information, vocabulary, or concepts, we want to talk about what they'll be skilled at. In other words, based on their content knowledge and based on what students will know, what will they then be able to do? So it could be basic know-how, it could be discrete skills, but again, it's as a result of bringing that content knowledge out of them, what can they now do with that? Sometimes you'll see that there is a one-to-one correlation between what students will know and what they'll be skilled at, but not always.
And honestly, if I could take a step back and put something here to visually depict what we're talking about, I think I would use sort of a cycle, having an arrow that points from skills to knowledge and then one back from knowledge to skills. There's an interplay here in what we're talking about, and all of it leads back to this idea that if students were placed in a novel setting and they could only rely on what they've already learned, can they transfer that knowledge and skills into this new setting in order to be successful with whatever the task in front of them is? So I think it's really important to see that all of these things are at interplay with each other to really create a solid foundation for learning. So finally, just here before we deviate away from this slide, you can see a couple of key points at the bottom as well. The knowledge and skill that are the core building blocks for later meaning making, they get back to that idea of transfer that we just talked about, that diagram, the two arrows pointing back and forth between knowledge and skills. When you plan to assess whether students have the targeted knowledge and skill, you're planning deliberately. You're looking for a meaningful sense of understanding and not just a checklist, of memorizing facts. What can they do with those facts that inform greater learning? And then again here, finally, targeted knowledge and skills fit within the unit. If we go back to talking about an earlier pitfall of chaining activities together, are those activities targeted to the knowledge and skills that you're talking about is really a first lens to apply. And then obviously going back, the time to debrief. So as we move forward, let's look at what happens when we close out this section and talk about the pitfalls.
So the pitfall related to acquisition is the failing to distinguish between knowledge and skill objectives. And I think Sonia and I did just talk about the difference between the two. And that's really, it's a key component to unit design, and understanding that there's more than just the content knowledge that you're trying to share with students. And when we look at standards and we have our own bias interests that we come to the table with, sometimes we get bogged down by the content and the knowledge, and we really want to make sure that we're cognizant of the fact that we're looking at skill objectives and making sure that we're providing opportunities for students to take that content and to apply it in meaningful ways.
And so let's look at what happens when we put these four facets together to form a completed stage 1 design. Now, bear in mind that we've selected from one of the sample units that Wiggins and McTighe have provided us something that talks a little bit more universally, something that we can all connect to, and that's learning to drive.
So when Sonia and I were putting this together, we thought really we wanted to make sure that we could put this in a context that was easily understood for everybody who's participating in this. So first, if we can look at that first component, which was the established goals. So listed right over here vertically on the left-hand side of your screen are the established goals for this unit that's being put together for driver's ed. So you'll notice here these aren't Massachusetts learning standards, but they're goals that that students are expected to achieve at the end of this unit. So the established goals are: students will drive the vehicle safely and responsibly, they'll negotiate the road correctly, they'll comply with signals, signs, and road markings, they'll interact appropriately with others on the road, they'll minimize risk when driving, and they'll learn from experience. So if you were compiling activities in this unit, these would be the goals that would drive the activities that you'd eventually put together.
So that as we move over to transfer, up here in the top, we talk about what students will be able to independently use their learning to do. And we have 2 key points that we called out here, again, sampling from our guidebook. We're going to talk about the fact that students would be able to, or drivers in this case, would be able to drive courteously and defensively without accidents or needless risk, and that they'd be able to anticipate and adapt knowledge of safe and defensive driving to various traffic, road, and weather conditions. And you'll notice that in both cases, these are starting out with verbs, which is helpful when we're talking about what they'll be able to independently do or how they'll be able to independently apply their learning. We want to get right to the action. What are they going to do? So we use verbs here to call out our transfer points.
So this is, again, the transfer of what we're hoping students will be able to do as a result of learning. Again, when you look here, none of this does it say, nowhere here does it say that students will memorize all laws related to traffic or anything like that. But it's all about really safety and what we know as adults to be good driving skills. That's the ultimate goal and the transfer that we want students to take away from this unit.
So likewise, we'll move from transfer down to meaning, and we can see the division between understandings and essential questions. So in talking about our understandings, we want to get at what will the students understand. And in this case, there's 3 bullets that are laid out here and what students would be able to understand or their key understanding. Defensive driving assumes that other drivers are not attentive and that they might make sudden or ill-advised moves, time needed, and effective drivers. You'll notice in each of these bullets, we're starting out with a noun, and we're talking about the understanding, the takeaway. It's in some cases, you might be talking about a person, a place. In this case, we're talking about things as our takeaways, so we want to put the nouns in place.
And these are things that students will understand at the culmination of the unit. So again, these aren't going to be taught discretely. You're not going to spend 2 lessons talking about defensive driving, but as a result of all the other teaching that's happening, students will come away from this unit with that understanding, hopefully.
And then you can see here that there's 2 key essential questions. What must I anticipate and do to minimize risk and accidents when I drive? And what makes a courteous and defensive driver? Both are open-ended. Both are addressed repeatedly throughout the unit within each lesson. And both help to foster a level of inquiry where students can talk about different risks, what they would do, different solutions or ways to minimize those risks. And it really forces a level of inquiry, and it could rise to a level of debate depending on students' understanding of different traffic laws and violations.
And these are certainly 2 points, if you were teaching this unit, that you could expose to students prior to learning. It would be a great way for a teacher, again, as I mentioned earlier, to do formative assessment to find out what students already understand about defensive driving, and then from there help to craft some different activities. But you could see how a student's answer to these questions would morph and form over time based on the learning experiences that they would partake in.
And so finally, as we look at the 4th and final facet of stage 1, we come down to talk about acquisition. And that's where we get to talk about the knowledge and skills. So on the knowledge side, what the students will know. And then you can see that over here on the left under acquisition. There are 3 bullets. And then on the skills side, what they're going to be able to do, what they're skilled at. And I'm very hopeful for the 4th bullet, for the parallel parking that makes so many of us nervous. But we can see here a clearer picture of stage 1. And if you've done a really good job at the heavy lifting of working through and talking about the end, what you want students to know, be able to do, be skilled at over the course of your unit, looking at stages 2 and 3 is going to be a little bit easier to do because you've set the lens. Now you're mapping that route.
And really, it's so important, even before you start planning one lesson, because we haven't even started talking about lesson development here, to really have a strong grasp of what is the goal that we need students, or what's the goal of our teaching, where do we want students to be at the end of this unit. Once you have a strong understanding of that, everything else will fall into place.
So let's then turn to our colleagues Wiggins and Matai for some final guidance or advice. In the logic of backward design, clarity about the nature of the learning objectives informs all other aspects of the unit plan and results in more effective learning.
If you're familiar with the UbD format, I think most people would agree that stage one is probably the most time-consuming part of unit development, just because you have to take some time to really wrap your head as the educator around what really is it that we're trying to get out of the students through this unit development process. It's not an easy thing to go through, but certainly once you spend the time crafting this part of the unit plan, the rest will fall into place. And really, that important part is that last statement in the quote, that it resulted in more effective learning.
And in some cases, you may start to determine what you want the learning to look like and determine what you want the assessments to be. And you can just hold those off in notes in the margins of your work around stage one and be better informed when you advance to stages 2 and 3. So finally, as we conclude part 1 of our 3-part series here, working through the stages of the Understanding by Design framework, we want to share with you the 3 sources from which we drew some of the content of our presentation. And all 3 are available in the Office of Curriculum Instruction for any of our colleagues to stop in and review or borrow.
If any of the educators in Falmouth have an opportunity to partake in either the full-day Understanding by Design training that Sonia and I do throughout the year, or the refresher training, all 3 of these resources will be at those trainings for you to look through. And as Sonia said, we're more than happy to share these with you as you go through the process of developing units of study and refining them and revising them, and remembering that we're always in a continuous cycle of curriculum development. So being cognizant of that is important, to know that once you're done, you can start right back over and and make your units of study even better and more effective.
And we're always happy to provide feedback along the way as you draft if you've got questions that you'd like to ask, or if you encounter one of the pitfalls we mentioned, or perhaps another one that we haven't included here today. So thank you very much for your time, and we wish you the best in your unit development.